I'll start.
Thank you. And Alyssa, you got your hand up.
Hi. I'm sorry, I jumped on about 8 minutes late, but it looks like you're creating a list of potential presentations for this group. And I'm working on a project which we are really excited to share some of the results with this group, and I think is kind of relevant. It might overlap with potentially this AAFM soil carbon info topic, but I'm working in collaboration with a number of different organizations across the state that are studying soil health to get a baseline assessment of where we're at, including soil carbon stocks. And it wouldn't have to be a long presentation, but I think it could be interesting to this group. And we hope to have early results, hopefully before the end of June. But it maybe it links up with what's already in a different presentation. So we could provide it in like a brief or paper format instead.
Okay, super. Thank you. Brian.
Yeah, just wanted to suggest that Alyssa absolutely would encourage you to take that time or placeholder. Just want to talk about this concept broadly, and definitely think the work you'd have to share would be very timely and relevant. So pushing back that time and date and giving you as much time as you need, I think that would be perfectly fine with us, of course.
And I'm sorry, Alyssa, could you just repeat the timing when you thought that work would be
Sure.
available?
Yeah, I don't think we need to delay what the agency is planning to do, because I think getting started in that conversation soon is a good idea. But we hope to have, so I'm sorry, did you ask for the name of it, Billy?
Just the date when you thought it would be kind of ready to bring to this group.
I hope that it'll be that we'll have preliminary data by June 15th or 20th.
Okay.
Maybe we can coordinate and see
Yeah.
what we both would like to share and have a presentation that tries to cover the basis in one meeting for this group.
Yeah, and these dates are not like set in stone. I'm just putting some rough.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm
timeframes
reliant on a couple other people finishing out lab work, and so it might get, I was hoping to be done by the end of June so it could be shared with this group before we were making recommendations, but it could get pushed out a little bit. So.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks everyone. I think this is enough for us to run with right now. Abby and I can kind of work through the list and Jane's help and come up with a kind of proposal for y'all. And if there's other people or ideas or concepts you think would be helpful to bring to the group, just shoot us an email and we'll work it in. All right. Thank you. I will stop sharing. Okay. So now, Jane, we went to that item to kind of bide a little time for you to join us. So thanks for being here. So I think we'll go back to the top of the agenda and touch real briefly on the spreadsheet that's been developed and opportunity for folks to add additional names for stakeholder outreach for climate access and RISE. I don't know if there's anything you want to say to that, Jane. I think you provided that to the group, but just to answer any questions.
Sure, thanks. So that has been now shared with Just Transitions, and the final step of that process was presented to Just Transitions last night as sort of three-pronged approach for their input now, which would be to take the cumulative work of the input from the subcommittee and create and support a final list, a prioritized list for the stakeholder interviews, which will be 21-hour one-on-one interviews with folks in that case who are aware, engaged in some way in the work or the implementation component of this work, but haven't been at the table yet is the intent, right? To reach a broader suite of partners that are engaged in the work but haven't been at the table. So there'll be the 20 interviews, of which I have been doing this. 20% of those interviews will at least be representative of representatives from the BIPOC community, and at least maybe Irish will help me remember 40 to 60% of those interviewees will be from frontline or impacted communities. So trying to represent where the population in Vermont is going to be impacted by the climate action plan. Then there'll be 2 roundtables, and that is So thinking about who should be targeted for one-on-one conversations, and then who should be at the table for the roundtable. One roundtable focused on community leaders in this space, and the other roundtable focused on providing an affinity space for BIPOC community members to voice input into the process. So that is all feeding into the audience analysis for the public engagement plan development, which you heard about last week. The public engagement plan will be completed roughly around the end of June. And that, just so folks know, because I know there's a lot of like, who's going to be at these roundtables and interviews, they are really just to inform the audience analysis for the public engagement plan, at which point there will be many more roundtables and interviews as we move into the implementation of the public engagement plan after July. So this will be provided as an update and summary at the Climate Council meeting on Monday for additional feedback from council members. So that's where we're at with that. I think the hope is that that final feedback from Just Transitions will be on that list will be by next Wednesday, the 26th, because their conversation kind of got a little bit shortchanged last night with Just Transitions because there was such productive work on the other components of that agenda. So, and then the month of June will sort of be those interviews and the roundtables and the public engagement plan development. And as I share with you in a moment, the major milestones, you'll see the next components of that and what the touch points are for your subcommittee. So that's all I have on that. I know there are folks who want to see that list. Oh, sorry, the other component that Just Transitions will inform is the questions that are, asked during the interview, and then the facilitation guide for the roundtables. And I think that will all be shared in some capacity with council members on Monday. There has been some feedback that council members should be able to provide input on that as well. And I'm going to talk about that with Climate Access and RISE, but I'm not sure we'll get to with that yet. Right now, it's really focused on Just Transitions being that touch point. Any questions on that?
All right, thanks, Jan. It's exciting to hear that process moving forward. Any more thoughts on that? Oh, let's see, we got something in the chat. Okay, more from our previous topic. Thanks, Judy. Okay, so I guess we will move on to our next agenda item, which again features Jane Lazorchak. And this is just kind of a refresher and discussion of the overall timeline for the compilation of the climate action plan, kind of the deliverables and expectations around the work of our subcommittee, and then the tools and templates that we may use to kind of pull that stuff together. And then I'd like to kind of morph it a little bit into a strategy conversation for us to begin around like how are we actually going to do this? How are the different task groups going to come together with their recommendations, understanding there's going to be some overlap, and what does our timeline look like to meet the overall timeline for the plan. So Jane, I don't know if you willing to lead that off, and then we can kind of run with it.
You guys are sort of my test subcommittee. The steering committee saw the milestones document for the first time yesterday. I've cleaned it up a little bit since then, and then it'll be part of a conversation with the Climate Council on Monday. But it's really no reason to wait sharing it with all of you because, it shows the aggressive nature of the timeline, to be honest, and Billy's right to really use it to inform some meeting planning for the next few weeks and sort of getting towards meeting the milestones. So if you'll bear with me, I will walk you through the sort of major milestones for the council work and really speaking to the role of the subcommittees. So this is very cursory. If you actually saw my own internal milestone project planning document, it would make your head spin even more than this one makes my head spin a little. So I'm trying to illustrate the major touch points around the public engagement and around the technical analyses that are all needed to inform the work of the subcommittees, which really speaks to the development of the strategies, the further refinement from the strategies to the recommendations, and ultimately what the implementation of those recommendations look like through rulemaking and financing options, which you'll have to get to by the fall. And so the phase one of that public engagement, which is what I just spoke to for all of you, is that audience analysis with the roundtables and interviews, which is happening right now with the development of all of you and will hopefully be concluded by the end of June, all of which is informing the development of the public engagement plan. The idea being that I had really hoped that in order to inform your work for July and to keep us moving rather speedily along, that would be ready for the June Climate Council meeting. But I just think that, well, I know that we won't be there for that. So just so you can all see too how I'm thinking about the main emphasis for the Climate Council meetings, in June, we are hopeful that we will have some major components of the technical analysis done, and some of that relates very much to your work. The first work out of the gate by the technical consultants will be the greenhouse gas inventory critique. How do we do the greenhouse gas inventory right now? How do other states do it? What's the availability or applicability of considering life cycle emissions? And then the carbon budget. The carbon budget is on track to be done first. And so I think that it will speak to some of your upcoming meetings and considerations with respect to coalescing around what the methodology for the carbon budget looks like. That public engagement plan will be presented, in fact, to the steering committee rather than the full council, but we'll take advantage of the meeting that the steering committee does on a Monday where co-chairs are all with us, so that plan can roll out to a larger audience, and use that week of July 12th also for that public engagement plan to be presented to all of the subcommittees for you all to consider the role of your strategy development and work in the context of the public engagement plan. So what that means then for all of you is that finalize, I should say, it's not your final, it is the first package though of your suite or bucket of strategies for the public consultants to test with Vermonters will need to be developed and presented by the July 26th Climate Council meeting. It really doesn't leave much time to implement engagement around that. So, but in all reality, there's just no way to say that you're not going to have that input from the roundtables and analysis till middle of June. So by the end of July, the idea will be that we'll be ready to roll with sort of phase 2 of public engagement, and that will happen during the summer. Really, though, during the month of August and beginning of September, which couldn't be a worse time for engagement around testing strategies. But for now, that's the way things are fleshing out. I suspect that will continue into the fall, but our hope is that by the September early meeting of the Vermont Climate Council, well, let me not jump ahead. During that time in the summer, I imagine while public engagement is happening, there'll be somewhat of a lull for subcommittees, although it'll also mean that you will be missing the real meat of the technical analysis and the economic analysis, but at the same time, you'll also be needing to take those strategies down to a recommendation level. So thinking about the big buckets of strategies and then the multiple recommendations that will be needed to implement any one strategy, you can be working on refining that. By the end of the summer, we'll have all of the pathways analysis finished by August. Some of that informs this work around the agricultural emissions work. All of that will be done, the non-energy sector, and packaged with the other sectors analysis, and as well as the presentation of that phase 2 engagement, which is Vermonters' reactions to your strategies. Note that there's a star on that September 13th Climate Council meeting, because at that moment, we're going to have to go to a biweekly council meeting is what I suspect will happen, because at that point, the role of the Climate Council will really be to be knitting together the full climate action plan. So the full council, I'm proposing will start to meet bi-weekly at that September meeting. The end of September, we'll have that preliminary economic modeling back to inform your financing options, your policy strategies, but we're not actually due to have the final economic modeling till the end of October at this point. So we'll be thinking about the early October meeting as your final strategies and recommendations that's informed by preliminary economic modeling, which we hope will only further be refined and strengthened later in the month. But our hope is that by October 11th, you're going to have your financing options ready to go to present to the full Climate Council as well. The next meeting will focus on the rules that need to be adopted. That'll be presented to the Climate Council, the economic modeling, the monitoring and assessment framework. And then it's all leading us to having a draft climate action plan by the November 8th meeting. And then that gives us less than a month to revise it, professionally edit it, do whatever we want, so that by December 1st, the Climate Council is adopting a climate action plan. Again, you know, as we spoke to last week, and as I'll continue to say, we'll be doing public engagement all along the way. We have been doing it, we'll keep doing it, but there'll still be the need for really refined public engagement after December 1st to test, review the complete package of the climate action plan and further inform that plan later in the winter. But I fully expect that we'll have a comprehensive plan. I'm going with not draft, but initial climate action plan for December 1st consumption by the council, and so that we can move into rulemaking and policy implementation with the legislature. I'm going to pause there and then suggest other needs and the next steps for now that we have this laid out and starting to think about how things will come together in the fall, and see if there's any questions. Charlie, I see your hand first.
Thanks, Jane. This is really helpful. I just wanted to clarify, and you just touched on it, but when you have the October 25th action of rules to be adopted presented to the Climate Council, is that actually, am I reading that right, like rulemaking by the legislature? Like that's what we're talking about?
Yep, the ANR has to adopt rules by the end of 2022. So these are the proposed rules that ANR would then go into rulemaking on starting in January.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
We have to have the batch of rules presented by July. Go ahead, Billy.
So the rules might actually precede the final plan to some degree, or like parallel tracks happening at the same time almost, or?
Yes, parallel with respect to the public engagement, the final public engagement and final plan in March. Is that what you're suggesting?
I guess
these rules will be batched into the plan. So I thinking that this will be the first time that they're presented to the full council for consideration and draft, then to be rolled into the plan in December.
Yeah, I think my read of this is that this is when we would acknowledge what rulemaking was necessary to accomplish the strategies. They wouldn't be like fully baked at that point, but.
Okay, awesome, thank you.
Thank you.
Judson brings up a great question in the chat. Is there a date for the task groups to present data to the subcommittee, and how much review or evaluation will occur before presenting to the public for its first phase?
Yep, so that's sort of the next step from this is what I see, right? If you have to have your final suite of strategies that you're intending to test with the public over the summer by the end of July, then now you're going to have to back plan how the task leads are going to bring those strategies up to the subcommittee for full consumption, so that you can, as a subcommittee, put together the package of strategies coming out of ag and ecosystem, not just individual task leads. Yeah, thank you for that. Lauren, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to call attention to that too, and just Jane shared this with the steering committee yesterday, and I think it's going to be really helpful for all of us as we understand what work we need to be doing over the course of the next several months, if not weeks. but I did flag in steering committee, and I wanted to for this subcommittee as well, just trying to understand the role of each of us as subcommittee members in developing parts of the plan that are going to eventually be presented to the full council. And I think that's still maybe still a standing question, since we're the ones that are going to be responsible for creating those strategies, recommended solutions, et cetera, how we fold those into something that's helpful for Jane, and that it looks a little bit consistent platform-wise with the other subcommittees, but that we're being useful and strategic and making sure that we're having our voices heard in the plan.
Yeah, that's great, Lauren. Thank you for that. And maybe I'll just speak to that really quickly by showing my next slide, if I can go. All of this for me in thinking about what I should be helping provide to all of you is really getting me to think about what I've been calling now that, like, how are we going to engineer the climate action plan? Whose articulation of responsibilities to all of you on how far you take things and what support you can expect from me and others, and clarifying those roles and responsibilities. First and foremost, I definitely think my role is around helping think about coordination of templates so that in the end, when all the subcommittees are presenting up the work, we have something that is similar in what they speak to across the subcommittees so that we can pull together the one voice across the climate action plan in a more easy, consistent way. I also think that, I may have mentioned this last week, that how we present those strategies and recommendations to the public, well, I should say specifically for the summer, your strategies need to be in a consistent presentation and understanding what that's going to look like, because we're not going to just share the spreadsheets with the public. From working with our consultants in the next week or two will be really important for all of you. So, like, is there also a slide deck that you're feeding into, or thinking about how your recommendations and strategies get funneled up into a cumulative presentation? That's something I'm thinking about. And thinking about the climate action plan, I'll just say that Julie and I have some time with CBI next week for a few hours to really actually think about roles and responsibilities, staff at A&R who are going to be able to help, what other additional resources do we need to knit it all together. And that gets to the additional contractual work also. I know we're going to need an editor to read the whole thing through. And then also thinking about Climate Access and RISE don't have in their contract sort of the beautification of the plan, making it look well received for the public, like many other climate action plans do. So we're thinking about where do we find that capacity, because we don't have it within A&R either. And then additional, I'll just highlight and flag, because probably you all should have a conversation about this more broadly too. And I've been negligent in helping facilitate that for all of you, but thinking about additional analyses, if any, to support your work. We have the consultants for the technical analysis have been selected. We're negotiating the contract right now. We have the best team that we all liked happens to also be the cheapest team that was in the proposals, which never works out like that, but we actually have resources left over for further analyses that I would encourage subcommittees to just think about, because again, we're never going to have resources like this again to do these kinds of analyses. And so today, the Rural Resilience and Adaptation meeting is focused on exploring. They're required by statute to consider a municipal vulnerability index. So we're going to consider existing tools in Vermont and what they do and don't do. And then we're also going to hear from Maine today about what they did for vulnerability indices for their climate action plan, and hopefully put forward a scope of work in the next few weeks around that component, which I don't expect to be done for this climate action plan. I almost feel like what's going to happen for the next 6 months is a methodology for developing one, and then we're still going to have to do it, because these kinds of tools take, the inputs to this kind of tool is what takes the longest time thinking about, is what I'm learning. So it'll really be about the methodology of developing one is what we'll think about for this plan likely. but thinking about other additional contract work. Yeah, and I'm going to stop sharing right now and then pause for questions, and then I have something else to show you. I don't know how to stop sharing. Okay, there it goes. Billy, I think you're muted, but does anybody have any? Oh, I see.
So there's a
David,
couple
people
questions
have
in the
comments.
chat. Yeah, I think one is who's the contractor that was selected for the technical analysis, and you can see him.
Yeah. I don't think I can say that yet publicly since we're in a contract negotiation phase right now. So we have a preferred consultant that we're negotiating a contract with. I will say that we had 4 excellent proposals, of which any of the 4 could do the work. So if for some reason, I don't expect that this will fall apart, this contract negotiation, but if not, we have other people behind us to work. And then the beautification of the plan, a communications plan. Yes, so Climate Access and RISE are thinking more about outreach materials, but haven't really been helping us think about a communication strategy. And actually, I was late this morning, a few minutes, because I was meeting with A&R's communications director to think about a communication strategy and talking points, and working with the Climate Council to think about key messages and how we start to do that, because we're all doing engagement. Climate Access and RISE are going to do engagement, and we should probably agree upon what the take-home messages are, so that every time someone's talking about this work, that we have some takeaway messages that we want people to leave with, and how do we support that strategy and message. I'm hoping that LOKC can help us all with that in the coming weeks. And I can't see about, David's comment. I really think that I'm really excited about the carbon budget component of the proposal that we're going to work on, hopefully. And I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity in the carbon budget also to be thinking about like forecasting and future work and land use trends. And so that's going to be a really exciting conversation to dive in with all of you around.
Jane, to that, I know we talked about bringing the task group of this subcommittee focused on the carbon budget together at some point. Should we just wait for on your lead until we do that?
Well, I wonder if Ali and Ryan want to speak to this, and or I don't think Colin's on this call, but we had a robust sort of dialogue about the carbon budget in the proposal review or the proposal review process, which made me think there are varying opinions amongst us all on what the carbon budget is going to do or not do. I think actually there might be benefit to pulling that group together sooner rather than later. But I ask all of you that so that we are in agreement on what we want. So then when we meet with the consultants about it, we can then have a plan with them that is coherent.
That sounds good to me.
Is that a fair representation, Ali and Ryan, about that sort of healthy disagreement that occurred?
Yes, I think so. I think it partially came, we're doing things quickly and kind of on the fly. So yeah, I think it would probably benefit, get the group together and get on the same page. And particularly with the potential for some extra funding that we have, thinking about, are there other ways we can expand the work of the carbon budget for some of those land use change analyses and things like that. I think that could really fall hand in hand.
So when I met with the consultants this week, this week about their proposal, I encouraged them again to look at their cost proposal and to add some headroom to the carbon budget, so that as we have the capacity there to ask more of them, and so and have a conversation with them. So I expect there's going to be room in that budget that we have in the proposal to actually direct additional work there. So sorry, Ryan, to interrupt you too.
Oh, not at all. Yeah, just agreeing or sharing the conversation was had, between, I think, kind of the established protocol of Chapter 6 of the EPA State Inventory Tool process, which hasn't yet been conducted for Vermont as a step one, but definitely agreeing with Ali where if there is additional budget availability, I think it would be very useful for the Climate Council and the subcommittee in particular to look at expanding that analysis in the way that Ali has framed it, as that really kind of helps share a comprehensive snapshot of a multitude of sectors in a way that I don't think the EPA protocol can fully capture. And definitely support us meeting to chat about that. But just wanted to share my perspective on what was discussed and what the distinction was. I don't think they're at odds. I think they're just different stages of analysis.
Okay. So, kind of what I'm taking from this conversation is that over the next couple months, we need to kind of focus our meetings and schedule them to kind of support the development of strategies along a timeline that gets them ready for the July 26th VCC meeting. We need to kind of set some internal deadlines and talk about what form those strategies will look like so that we as a subcommittee can pull that work in from the task groups and get it all aligned and homogenized so we can deliver on that deadline. We'll pull together the carbon budget task group as soon as possible to begin to consult on that piece. And then we need to probably set a deadline for when we would want to make additional technical analysis requests of the consultant. Any other thoughts or discussion to this? So I think the big picture is that July 26th is kind of the deadline for when we need to have our initial, or presumably before that meeting is the deadline where we're going to need to have our initial strategies hammered out.
Yes. And so I have a couple of suggestions about how to move forward with some of the things you just suggested, if that.
Great.
So as part of, it feels like there's two threads, right? There's like the development of the tools needed to funnel that work up. And then there's the actual work planning out the next few meetings to think about how you get to that end goal. And so to both of those ends, I just want to make a few comments. So the work planning tool, we did a really rudimentary tool with cross-sector where we just sort of looked at those major tasks and started to think about how to get there with the next few meetings and who has to present when and how we make decisions. And then I want to take it further with them and others, and Pat Field, who's your facilitator from CBI, who also facilitates rural resilience and adaptation, sent, I don't think this is for public consumption, and Ryan's probably going to be upset that he even shared it with me, but he sent the great tool for that AAFM uses for mapping out meetings. I'm pretty sure it's for the ecosystem services work group for like planning meetings out and sort of the where you are in what phase of the work and how those meetings are helping you move to the next phase of the work. It's really not, it's like a nicer version of an Excel spreadsheet that just helps you plan out the buckets of work. I would suggest, and I suggested that Billy and Abby and I would welcome anybody else from the subcommittee take a stab at thinking about that in the next week and then share it at this meeting with all of you so you can see sort of at least the next 4 meetings that you're not doing agenda planning at the end of each meeting. You really see how it's all coming together. That would be one bucket of planning. And then the second other bucket is you have this great MCA tool. As part of that MCA tool, there was the prioritization framework that you all developed. I looked at that with what we also were thinking about developing for strategies and recommendations framework for cross-sector, and was trying to think about how to marry them, because I really feel strongly, but I'm open to being challenged by any of you, that we really need consistent templates for strategies and recommendations, recognizing that some things for cross-sector don't make sense for ag and ecosystems, but I really think like consistency is going to help in the end pull the plan together. So I informed that template with yours and vice versa, and the cross-sector mitigation work group or template like group is meeting next Tuesday to look at their template to have a more final draft presented at their meeting on Thursday. And I'm wondering about working and then making sure I merge it with a smaller group of some of you who helped develop that first one to ensure that we're true to what you developed in the first place, but also make sure we're consistent with what other work groups, what other subcommittees are doing, so that in the end we can pull it all together more seamlessly. So I'd love if a few of you wanted to work with me on your template also, so that there's consistency there. So I kind of see these two things, like that's the first thing, the template consistency, and then planning out some meetings so we're all moving towards the milestones as one unit. Really fun options for you all. So hopefully you'll all eagerly jump on board to help with that. So Lauren, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a clarifying question for you, Jane, because what I think I'm hearing might be two different things. I agree, consistency across the subcommittees, especially for when we actually put them in a plan, makes a lot of sense. But is what you're trying to create between the two just kind of the final iteration of the strategies and what they look like, versus how I'm kind of picturing the MCA and the prioritization tool is just how this group internally is going to get to those final list of strategies that could then inform the more homogenized template across subcommittees.
I don't think you're going to want to have like multiple Excel spreadsheets that you're feeding. I think that they're one and the same, and so maybe we should talk about that. That final list of strategies prioritization that you have, I think with a few changes like that is sort of that is your final piece of strategies that come out of this. Recognizing that there might be like another Word template or something that we move to, but I think that we want one Excel document, so we're not having multiple ones. I hope that makes sense. I'm not sure if I answered.
I think Lauren's question was more, she's envisioning the MCA as like a tool internal to this committee to inform what we put in the spreadsheet. And it sounds like that's okay, provided we can do that on the time frame to deliver the kind of one Excel spreadsheet.
Yeah, so like when I was looking at cross-sector in yours, you have the MCA tool, cross-sector doesn't, but the rest of the like columns in your prioritization tool are very similar to what we were doing with cross-sector's strategy recommendation spreadsheet. You just had some things that they didn't, or different language around it, and they don't need to have a drop-down MCA tool if they don't choose to use that as a directional tool for their strategy prioritization, and that can be different. But in general, that MCA tool is feeding into a template that looks similar to the template that cross-sector is having, although minor. Like they would have some things that you won't have, like cumulative impact to 2025 statutory requirement. You guys don't have that, they do, but there's overall consistency around language for the buckets, and then the drop down for the equity assessment or guiding principles, things like that could be the same. Without showing them both right now, maybe it's confusing to speak to it, but I think the MCA tool is in and of itself a tool for this committee, and that's great. Other subcommittees may choose to do something similar, but then it's that overall thing that MCA tool is just one bucket of for your prioritization is what I'm hoping to have commonality with.
Okay, thank you. I'm happy to, and would actually like to be a part of that conversation.
Thank you. That's
Thanks.
great.
Okay. Any other thoughts? I know this is a lot to digest, and I think maybe we can get Pat Field back at maybe our next meeting to kind of dig into like the implications of this on us and how we put together like a nice clear work plan and schedule for us to get from here to July 26th, which is just a couple months away. Great. All right. Any other thoughts, comments, feelings? All right. Well, I guess with that, we're going to wrap up this topic. Thanks, Jane. That's a lot of work and thinking. And move on to our first opportunity for public comment for this week's meeting. So as always, thanks for members of the public for your interest in our work. We've got 2 opportunities for comment now and at the end of the meeting. Anyone who's interested in speaking now, please raise your hand through Zoom or otherwise identify yourself. Okay, not seeing anyone yet. Okay, well, I think we don't have anyone at this point, but certainly, oh, there's Jennifer.
Sorry, I couldn't find my raise hand feature
Okay, no
on
problem.
Zoom. I was really interested in the first portion where you were talking about various presentations that were going to be given. And I completely realized that this is probably out of the purview of what is going to be helpful at this point. But I wanted to bring up something like the Open Space Institute. And I wanted to bring up their February 21st announcement of interest in what they're referring to as Northern Appalachian region and carbon sequestration and storage in the forests. And a good portion of Vermont shows up on their map with that. And so I'm thinking of these things that, if we could guarantee the conservation of a bunch of forested land, agricultural land in Vermont. And I want to weave into that equity as well, which I'm sure that they're not, I saw nothing on their website which really highlights that. But wouldn't it be great if we could find an intersection with these 2 things? So again, I fully understand that a presentation by the Open Space Institute or something like that is probably not in the cards. But I keep thinking about the urgency of conservation and the urgency of equity. So I just wanted to bring that up.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. That's really helpful information. And, while we may not go for a full-blown presentation from OSI here, I think that's certainly good information for a couple of our task groups who are certainly going to be focused on the role of land conservation to look at and reference and maybe have some direct communications with OSI around. And I would hope to think some of the other members of the conservation community represented in the subcommittee are aware of that work. And if not, we'll certainly dig into that. So thanks for sharing that.
Great. Thank you.
Any other members of the public interested in sharing thoughts or comments right now? Okay, there'll be another opportunity later this morning. Okay, so now we're at our weekly installment of our report outs from the task groups. Just kind of quick updates of noteworthy things. And Iris, since I was totally remiss in missing you last week, why don't you start it off and give us an update from Just Transitions?
Yeah, I think that Jane probably covered most of what our meeting was early in the meeting, but we spent a majority of it finalizing, well, not finalizing, but getting our guiding principles better, and we're hopefully going to get those to all, not now, but at the climate council meeting. So that's the big update.
Great, thanks, Iris. Any questions for Iris? It sounds like Just Transitions is doing a ton of really good and hard work, so appreciate you participating in that and keeping us apprised. Okay. Abby, would you like to give us an update from your task group?
Mine is very quick. We are meeting on Wednesday. And we're all thinking very broadly and deeply about all of these things in our day-to-day existences. And we will meet next Wednesday. That is all. All
right, that's a good update. I probably have a similar one, so I'll go now for the natural and forest land sequestration and storage group. We're meeting next Tuesday morning. I've encouraged folks to, think about and hopefully begin to populate a spreadsheet, a shared drive that we have with ideas and strategies to forward that work. I'm going to meet with Allie and probably Marley Roop from A&R later today to kind of just talk about how we structure that work going forward so it's most effective, and bring some suggestions back to the group on Tuesday morning. But hopefully we'll really get rolling starting early next week. Let's see, Lauren.
Oh, perhaps maybe just a bit longer than Abby's. We met on Tuesday. We'll meet again next Tuesday. Big news is that Iris will be joining us on our team for nature-based solutions. And I believe Jane just left, but I think Jane is going to be coming to our meeting next week to talk a bit about wetlands. We walked through a couple of different strategies that we have been putting into our growing list on Google Docs, and had some good conversations around many of them. And we committed to each connecting with at least one of our growing list of stakeholders between meetings for any feedback that they might have on the strategies as we've developed them so far. But I would look to John or Jake or Allie. Judy missed us this week for any updates that I might have missed.
All right, thumbs up. And then Ryan, I think you can go for it.
Sure. Subtask Group 5C met yesterday, Thursday. We'll be meeting again next Thursday. We're really starting to dig into the details of a large list of available practices. It's getting serious when you start adding colors to organize stuff. Our homework for next week is to take a look at this very long list, about 130 or so practices, try to identify if anything is missing, things that aren't currently included in the ranking, and then see, also flag things we don't want to have included for discussion, and then more thoughts on how to group and bucket these potential options for ease of analysis or just further discussion of different approaches to strategies and programs that could be set up to support those options. So we're really getting into it.
130, setting the bar high for all of us. I like it.
We didn't make the list. It existed.
Right.
But it was a long one.
We stole the list from NRCS, just to be clear.
Fair enough. Any other questions, comments, reports, updates from task groups? Awesome. Well, good work, everyone.
I have a quick question, Billy.
Yeah, please.
Are you I tried to search just now, but I couldn't find it. Are you the lead for the carbon budget task group? And if so, should we just be looking for an email from you based on the previous conversation?
Ryan and I believe, are the co-leads. So yeah, either from one of us, we'll reach out to folks probably later today and try to get something scheduled.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. Okay. Anything else on task groups? Very good. So let's see. So that brings us to presentation topics for upcoming meetings. We took care of that earlier. Abby and I will give some thought to the conversation and come back with some proposals next time for that. So we're just running ahead of schedule here. So that's going to bring us to kind of our unstructured group chat brainstorming time. We had a pretty in-depth conversation earlier about timelines and expectations. So if folks have had a chance to ruminate on that and want to discuss it more now, that's fine, but certainly open the floor to any other topics people would like to raise. Thank you, David. Please.
Yeah, thanks, Billy. I was brainstorming yesterday with Lauren a little bit, trying to think about the things that feel like larger questions. Like I find myself feeling like the work we're doing in task groups is really helpful and making progress. And at the same time, I'm struggling a little bit to figure out how we're going to translate it into a set of larger policy recommendations. And so I thought I was trying to think of some three kinds of obstacles that might be coming from. One is it's hard to envision what our overall like big picture recommendation is. And I wanted to put out a straw proposal in that regard. And so that's one topic. The second thing was, I think that if once we agree on kind of what that is, what that big picture is that we're headed for, we should probably try to figure out how to translate that into both, we may need speakers to help give us kind of some baseline data that we can kind of react to. And then secondly, we may need some help from the consultants to fill in the gaps. Like, this will make more sense when I get to the details. And then the third idea I had for place we might spend time is another obstacle is that there are some embedded conflicts that we haven't really lifted up and worked through. And I was thinking that maybe we should task each of the task groups, add that task to the task groups to come up with a list of like, what are the hot spots that we've kind of touched on but avoided, or we just haven't touched on because we've been afraid of them, and bring them and flesh them out and like dive into them. So there's the three thoughts I had. And if you'll bear with me just for a second, just so I could give a little more color to the first couple ideas. And those who have been in the task group discussions with me will recognize what I'm about to say, which is I increasingly have been thinking that we are, not that we're in competition with the other subcommittees, but I do fear that in some ways our challenge is that it's so complex, the talking about the natural systems, that it will fall to the wayside and areas where it's easier to quantify. You know, if we had X amount of solar energy, if we had Y amount of renewable energy, that those things will be easier to kind of be advocate for than the idea of, well, we need more wetlands. So with that, I've been thinking, like, what if we started to think about, and I'm drawing on my experience in the Lake Champlain watershed cleanup, where we said, here's where all the water pollution is coming from in a pie chart. And we had a slice for farms, and a slice for development, a slice for back roads, and a slice for forests, and a slice for whatever. And did I mention farms weren't there? And we said, here's what's existing, and it's too much, it's too big, and we need to reduce it. And then we had another pie chart that was smaller, and it said, here's the targets. And then we had to come up with a plan and say, for each sector, why is it that farming is a source of phosphorus? What are those sources, and how are we going to get them to a smaller amount? We have kind of the opposite idea here. Like we don't have enough working lands. And the trends are bad. We're losing farmland. We're losing forest land. What if we said we want to increase the investment of the state of Vermont in forest land and in farmland and in other natural associated lands like wetlands and floodplains? And we had some targets that we began to work out, you know, and it could start general, and then we could, each topic, you know, gets more detailed. Like when you're in forest land, it's not just forest. There's really heavily cut forest. There's lightly managed forest with ecological, you know, goals. And then there's, you know, wilderness, and I'm probably leaving out some categories. Same with farmland. There's different kinds of farmland. There's hay, there's annual crop, there's livestock. But setting some goals like that for ourselves, even if we did it in a conceptual way, feels like that would be, I would start to feel directionally like, okay, now I can start to plug in the idea of these more detailed ideas into a bigger whole. And that then leads to the second set of things, like that would create more concrete ways for us to figure out who we need to come speak to us. Like I love this idea of having Eric talk about conservation design. And using some of the conservation design numbers might be some great targets that we start with. But then ask, all right, so if we achieve those targets, then what does that mean? And getting expert help in terms of defining that. So I talked too long, but those were some ideas I had that I was interested in getting the group's reaction to. And thanks to Lauren, really, for instigating my thinking around all of those.
Thanks, David, for articulating that, because I guess, you know, I feel a little remiss because I've taken a little of that for granted, frankly. I'm kind of coming to this conversation from the place that our kind of primary strategy and responsibility is to advocate for maintaining and increasing the amount of natural forested and working land in the state, given its outsized role in storage and sequestering carbon and providing adaptation and resilience to climate change. So I think that's always where I've kind of seen our like most pressing responsibility is advocating for that outcome. But I think saying that in a more concrete way and then going the next step and beginning to talk about what those targets look like does make a lot of sense. You know, my hope and expectation is that through development of the carbon budget, we'll be able to get those kind of relative pie charts of, you know, what sort of services are those landscape types already providing the state, and give us some real hard numbers and metrics that we can build targets off of. But I totally agree with what you're saying, and it's kind of in line with what I've been thinking already. So it'd be great to hear others' thoughts on that. Charlie.
Thanks. Yeah, I think just to kind of an extension of that is that I think in some instances, at least personally, I get kind of wrapped up in like getting too detailed and too like, oh my gosh, how do we get that number? We need that number. But I think an extension of what Dave is talking about is kind of being comfortable with saying, okay, when we deliver this plan in December, there's going to be recommendations in there that we might not have the targets for, but the recommendation is between now and 2030, establish the targets for that plan, you know? And so we might not need to have that magic number, but if we have the steps articulated, and then as far as like how that gets thrown into the big mix and how it kind of percolates, that's where we come in to basically advocate really, really strongly for it as best we can, so that that maintains at a high level in the final plan. So yeah, I think David's spot on, and it helps the thought process.
Lauren.
Yeah, I think I've heard David say pie chart a lot lately. And I think having an actual visual of where we are now and where we as a subcommittee, you know, values-based conversation think we need to go is really, really helpful actually, and helps us kind of develop policy strategies around that, understanding it, using whole numbers. We have, you know, we have 20% forested land and we want to get to 30%. How are we going to get there, kind of thing? I know it's much more than that, but
78.
my only concern with trying to couch all of this into the carbon budget conversation, and I know that you all are going to get so sick of hearing me say this, but I'm going to have to continue to be this person, is that there is more to our natural and working lands than their inherent carbon sequestration and storage capacity. And because it's harder to measure adaptation and resilience, though I'm glad to hear that Chris Kaliba is willing to come and talk a bit more about some metrics that do exist. I don't want to have the potential to undervalue our natural and working lands because they don't necessarily get to a certain amount of carbon sequestration and storage. That there is value in protecting ag lands for ag production and local food supply, that there is value in keeping or actually restoring connected floodplains as something that is a huge ecosystem value and necessary for all of the things, to include flood resilience and drought resilience. So I'll flag that as something that as part of the conversation moving forward, to not necessarily think that the carbon budget conversation is going to be completely comprehensive in that regard.
Sure. Allie, cue the pie chart.
Yeah, I do love pie. I do love charts. But one thing I was just gonna point out, and maybe this is very obvious, but I think it would be helpful for us as a group to convey this, is there is a difference between keeping forest as forest or keeping ag as ag, wetland as wetland, versus transitioning other lands back to that type of land use, right? So I think there is a key difference there. If we talk about like no net loss, that could mean that you're allowing areas to regrow, which is great. We should also have that. Tree planting, natural regeneration is great, but where we are losing forests about 2,000 to 4,000 acres a year on average since the early 2000s. And some years it's quite a bit higher than that. This year might be one of those years with big development. So just wanted to put that on the radar. And, in this conversation, there might be potential here, as Jane flagged at the beginning, we have some extra funding for analysis. There are a bunch of data sets that could be combined to help us kind of understand and quantify those losses, because we can actually put, carbon losses from land and also other ecosystem service losses. And that, might be able to get people's attention that losing that land in its current state is a big loss, and you don't gain those services back for a while if you can, try to regrow forest.
Judy, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I've been listening for a while and thinking about this. I'm not sure if this falls into ag or if this falls into ecosystems or what, but I've been noticing lately a lot of huge colonies of like sumac and blackberries and things like that are just getting cut down because I don't know why. They just don't seem to fit in with the view of other people. But in reality, there are places in this country where, like Aspen, for example, a colony has grown to over 100 acres. And when you go to the center of the colony, you find out it's over 40,000 years old. And some of these colonies around where I live are just getting cut down. There was like this 3-acre colony of sumac that got cut down for the proposed beltline that has been proposed for 35 years of my life. Who knows when it's going to happen? But it was a good 2 to 3 acre colony that cut down. And I just don't want to forget those colonies because they're important. They're connected either below ground or above ground, like strawberry plant colonies. And they're just out there. And I'm not sure they fit into a category of the forest or they fit into a category of agriculture, but they're there, they exist, and they're intricate and interconnected with a lot of our lives.
Indeed. Other thoughts? Yeah, John.
I find this all fascinating, and what really interests me is the interconnection of a lot of these things. There are things that can be done in agriculture that have weighing the benefits of that over trees, and if there are benefits, or whether it's all just so related. I actually was, we have a situation here that is so different to California. I just was reading an article that was talking about, because of their drought, because of their huge accumulation of fuel for forest fires, there are some people there arguing that grasslands are far better at sequestering carbon because some of the forest land is going to burn up and be burnt up and just release all that carbon. And whereas grassland, when it burns, most of the root structure survives and comes back much quicker. But it was an interesting comparison as to, we don't have that issue here so much because so far we tend to stay I mean, we do have some forest fires. It's interesting, the one I've been reading about in Killington area, but they're very small and they tend to get washed out in time. But the main interest for me is just the relationship between these different areas and my concern that we don't get ourselves locked into very narrow focus that, oh, you must do this, you must do that, because, you know, everything's going to change in time and we need to have that flexibility, but we need to be moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I have some thoughts, but Abby, why don't you jump in?
No, go ahead. If you have something in regards to that specifically.
Yeah, well, just I think generally, you know, kind of the vision I have is, you know, we may start with a goal of, you know, no net loss of forested, natural and working lands. And then, you know, the next tier down is how do we manage those resources in a way that maximizes carbon mitigation and resilience and adaptation? And then where are the kind of places of competition where, you know, there's relative merit to agricultural, natural, or forested use, and you know we have to sort through those things. And as you say, John, I don't think we're going to nail all that stuff down, but if we can provide some directional strategies on, you know, how to maintain that no net loss and then how to resolve some of those conflicts, that might be a great place to land for this, you know, initial plan. So I think let's Abby and David.
Let's see. One, I have an example that our farm has faced that I think is a place where if we wanted to work through an example of some embedded conflicts, we could, which I think would be a valuable exercise for the subcommittee. And I would just be sort of really interested to hear the group's take on this conundrum because it's deeply relevant to the work at hand. And two, I do think at some point, and I would assume that this would come about in some of the equity assessments and things like that, but I have noticed that we tend to talk about keeping land in ag or keeping land in forests, or one, to my comment, there's a really big difference between, for example, conserving farmland and having farmland that is being managed or stewarded in a way that's producing the climate benefits that we wish to have it produce. And that is deeply reliant on people, the land managers and the land stewards, which is something that we absolutely do not value or discuss ever in this process in terms of how those people are resourced to do that type of work. We assume it's something that they'll do because it's the right thing. And then we regulate them or use punitive measures essentially when they're not doing that, as opposed to reframing that as like, how can we properly resource people to do the work that we need them to be doing? And it is very often the people who are doing that work that are the least resourced in our current agricultural framework. So those were the two things that I wanted to say. So if we reach a point where you want to work through an example, I have one ready. Let me know if today's the day to do that, or if we want to do it another day, and I'll leave it there.
Great. Yeah, no, I think that'll be a great conversation, but maybe let's wrap this thread down first. So David, you had your hand up, and then Allie.
Yeah, just I wanted to ask the group to keep your minds open to the idea that we don't need to compromise on some approach that involves, let's slow the rate of loss of forest land. Let's slow the rate of loss of carbon from our natural systems. And instead, and not even accept the known net loss idea, but embrace the idea that we could actually use our natural lands and assets as a way of increasing our climate resilience and our carbon storage and sequestration rates. And I think about that both, and I don't want to discount the very real practical questions around that. And I think it's more complicated than just saying we now have 72% of forests, we want to get to 82% or whatever it might be. You know, it's, you know, there's how is the forest managed? And as Abby said, how's the farmland managed? We want to grow the amount of sustainably harvested forests. We want to grow the amount of sustainably managed farmland. But I still think we should think a bit broadly about growing the entire amount. And it's not impossible to think about recovering developed land. It's not great, it's not ideal, but if we want to be engaged in long-term thinking about something as existential as climate change, we should probably be thinking about what that might look like. And the other piece of this for me is politics. And I don't mean partisan, but the vast majority of Vermonters and the people that are moving here that are in some ways putting this at risk want the Vermont landscape to remain something like it is now, with settled downtowns and villages and open working lands and wild spaces around. That basic framework is something that's wildly popular within our state. And if we can speak to that and build on it, we have a chance to really tap into that energy. And the other political thought that I have is that the extent to which we get into conversations about should we convert farmland to forest land, as an example, then brings out the fight, you know, and we're all primed for it. We've spent the last how many decades having that fight. It'll bring out the fight of how much land should be wildland and wilderness versus how much should be managed forest. There's a whole group of us on all sorts of sides of that are ready for that fight. And one way for us as policymakers to think about how to step beyond that fight is to say, it's not about taking land out of farmland. It's not about not harvesting forests. Everybody's feeling like we're living in a time of scarcity. If we start increasing the resource and our goals around the resource, then everybody has something to gain. So I know that sounds somewhat shallow, but that's the way my brain works.
Not shallow at all. Allie.
Yeah, I just wanted to put a plug in for, I haven't heard this really in this discussion, that our natural working lands are forests and ecosystems. Yes, they can provide us climate change benefits and ecosystem services, but they're also incredibly vulnerable to climate change. And I think that's something that we need to keep in the forefront, right? That the status quo might not be what continues in the future, and that a lot of locations, a lot of these places might need stewardship from us to be in the best condition to withstand extreme weather events. So there's a give and take here. It's not just those ecosystems serving us, need to go back and forth. So just wanted to put a plug in for that.
Yeah, I think there's a balance of protecting what we've got plus building on it that we need to focus on. Ryan, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Having trouble this week remembering that. Just wanted to, I apologize if I've already raised this within the context of this group. Definitely agree with having this conversation. And I think it's important, and agree, Billy, with many the way you framed it about the importance of Vermont's natural and working lands in providing resilience and opportunities for greenhouse gas mitigation. When looking at agricultural land users, farmers, one thing that I'm particularly struck by is based on the Ag Census, they manage more woodland than they do cropland. And they manage just a little bit more cropland and pasture than they do woodland. And so obviously some of that's used for maple sugaring, but a lot of that's a woodlot. And if you add up, there's only 12% of Vermont that's in agriculture. But if you add the forest component, it gets up closer to maybe 20, 25%. And so this kind of just nexus and thinking about loss or transition, at the very least, just elevating that, farmers are stewards of both land uses in many cases. That's just something I'm sure folks are very aware if you're part of this group, but that's just one point I keep returning to when we talk about keeping land in agriculture or improving how we manage farmland is there's almost always a woodlot associated with that agricultural land, from my view.
Great point. Jake.
Yeah, I want to just bring something up that sort of came up in some of our task group conversations, or starting to come up, and also sort of compelled to say this based on Abby's comment about, difference between sort of ag and climate smart ag. And then John mentioned too California. So, California has their own global warming solutions act, which was passed back in 2006. And it's just interesting that, they've really adopted, climate smart sort of agriculture as like a framework from a policy perspective. So I think I'm going to post a sort of a paper on this, California as a case study. But one of the things that's emerged in our task group is there's a lot of programs that exist now were sort of designed under a not necessarily climate smart paradigm. So there's just this question of, how much of what we have in place can be adapted to kind of integrate those concepts, and how much of what we are recommending and potentially proposing through the plan will require real fundamental, like, administrative restructuring, or sort of cleaning and new scoping of how programs are designed. And so that's just an interesting, I think, one of those maybe tensions and dynamics that's starting to emerge is, there's ways in which this work is so integrated and interconnected that, the way that programs and services have been designed in the past haven't necessarily been designed to bring those connections to bear. So, I feel like there's going to be obviously a lot of kind of programmatic and administrative impacts for agencies and organizations, but that, I really do feel like we're entering an age where climate smart, climate economy is the paradigm, is the framework that we need to really be organizing, ourselves around. And then something else that Abby just said too is sort of, I was looking at this from I've been diving into like climate smart, like financing. And one of the things they talk about a lot is sort of demand side policies and supply side policies. And that applies too to what Abby was saying about land managers and regulations. So regulations are creating kind of a demand for something, and then you need to have incentives and supports to create the supply. And so I just want to kind of introduce that as maybe just a way in which we also think about, our recommendations is that, is this something that's sort of creating demand for a service, and then is there a corresponding support incentive for supplying that to the public, and just, kind of using it as somewhat of a organizing principle for how we evaluate things. So that's, so I think there's a lot to learn probably from California around around a lot of this work as well. And there's the link.
Nice. I think that's a great complement to some of the goals that David was articulating. And I think this is going to have to be like really multifaceted, right? We're trying to move this whole thing forward, and it's not just we need more of this, or we need to promote these sorts of economic structures. It's going to all have to be, we're going to have to wage this on a number of fronts, and they're all going to have to communicate and support each other. So I think that's going to be the hard work of us pulling all this stuff together in a comprehensive way under a few guiding principles that really makes that compelling argument for our strategies. All right, well, I know this has been really helpful, and I think we should all spend some more time thinking about how we define these overarching goals so that we can have that structure to pull our strategies under, and it will help us resolve kind of areas of disagreement or where some strategies are bumping up against each other. And we can spend some more time on that now, or maybe come back to that next week and shift to the other topic that David brought up and Abby has an example for, kind of the embedded conflict in some of our work. So folks want to stick with this, move on to that topic. All right, silence means move on, I think. So unless, David, is there anything else you want to kind of wrap up on that previous topic before we do move on?
No, I so appreciate people being patient with my trying to frame things at this larger scale. So thank you for that.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, so this next topic that you brought up, David, that kind of the natural conflict or embedded conflict in some of this work is something Abby and I actually were talking about earlier this week, and I know she feels strongly that we need to start to take head on, and I agree with that. So I don't know if either of you want to kind of frame up the conversation for the group right now.
David, I can, or you can. The only way I was going to frame it is I just figured I would share an example that we've faced here, and then sort of let us talk through what comes up as we think about that, because it has seemed to me in other conversations, and some of you have heard me talk about this example, that these are the real conflicts that come up that impact people and our lands, like on a sort of micro basis, but that if we're not thinking about on a macro level, we might be in danger in terms of how we're structuring our policies. So I just want to call attention to it. A few years ago, we have worked with a private landowner for 35 or so years. Now, this is for the last 15 years been managed organically. So for example, the things that means is that the power company cannot spray anywhere near this acreage. There's a buffer zone for that. So it's managed differently with pesticides, and therefore the land is managed differently. This is perennial grassland, which has the highest carbon sequestration potential as far as the data is showing thus far. And all of this acreage that this one landowner holds represents all of the feed that we generally can produce, except for last year in a drought, to sell to other local organic farmers who are doing similar work, keeping pastures and perennial grasses, et cetera, doing intensive rotational grazing. A few years ago, this landowner was approached by Green Mountain Power to put up a solar array on these fields. Luckily, this landowner had worked with us for a long enough time that they at least did notify us. But at the end of the day, we ultimately had no control in what happened with that land, and it was privately owned, and as farmers, you have no right to that land. And particularly in the situations of small farms like ours, you tend to have a significant portion of your land that you're managing that you do not own. It's simply, we don't have the economic ability to own all the land we would need. So luckily this passed and they didn't put up the solar array. And so, or maybe not luckily, I don't know. That's a question. Is it luckily? Which would be better, the solar array or the grassland? That's a really important question. Also, and I don't know the answer to that, and I'm curious what your answers or thoughts would be to that. When I have talked with solar people about this example, I have been told that I just need to change my management to incorporate the solar panels. That is a really complicated thing to put on particularly small farmers who often are not resourced enough already. And it's yet another piece where the farmers tend to be the person who is considered last in these equations, and it is often put on them to deal with whatever repercussion is the fallout, i.e., oh, you can just graze sheep. Well, no, I can't. Sheep are really impossible to manage organically, or at least quite difficult. I am a certified organic producer. That is not something I can do easily. It would mean bringing in an entirely different livestock option. It would mean building new structures. It would mean getting the okay to do that on land that's not mine. Let's be real. There is no mine, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm curious, like in the scope of the strategies, prioritizations, et cetera, the frameworks we're putting forward, these are the real things that on the ground happen every day that tend to, again, from a farmer's perspective at least, just they get played out in the big upper level, you know, between the developer and the landowner, and the farmer is kept out of that. And yet I'm doing management on that land that is precisely what we're seeing is really important to the future that we hope to see here. And I am right near Mount Snow. So this land is at extremely high risk of development. It will be sold within the next 4 years, I would guess. The man who owns it is 76. So I think I'm just interested, like, how do we actually work through these really complicated, nuanced pieces as we develop out these policy frameworks? Who wins, who loses? Or does anybody have to lose? Is there a
Everyone can
solution?
win.
If I, Billy, could I weigh in a little bit?
Absolutely.
Just one of the values, I think, of our having this conversation about how to deal with conflict is that if we try to avoid it, then we'll end up at the end of the day, we'll have a set of recommendations that come forward, and, you know, some subset of us will have put forward something in writing, and then some subset of us will feel threatened by it or pressured by our colleagues, you know, to be opposed to it. And then we'll have kind of a splintered result, which may be inevitable. I don't know that. I don't think it is. But the best hope of not doing that is to tee up a question like Abby just did, and then figure out a process for resolving it, you know, and figuring out, making sure everyone feels heard and respected. And then we kind of make something out of it. And it may be that it is win-lose, maybe it's that clear cut, or maybe it's not. Like in the context of the solar and farmland, and frankly, the balance with wilderness and forests, I think about examples I've seen where effective planning processes that then have teeth, planning that leads to actual accountability, can result in resolving those in a way that, you know, there are people that do better or do worse, but nobody feels like they've lost. Everyone's had a voice. And generally on the Vermont landscape, like a few of you have heard me talk about a presentation that Jim Sullivan did down in Bennington County. He's the head of the Regional Planning Commission down there. And they did a pilot project a few years back to look at how much land was available for renewables. Billy, you probably have seen this, right? And it's a fascinating piece of work. It was a great idea. I don't know why we haven't done it across the whole state now. It was I thought, a successful pilot.
We have.
Pardon?
That work has been done by all of the regional planning commissions now. So that pilot turned into a statewide effort.
Oh, that's great to hear. Well, yeah. That shows me. So, but I mean, just for others who aren't familiar with it, what they did was they just went and did an inventory. What's all the land that could be potentially developed out into renewables? And then they compared that to how much actually needed to be developed in order to meet their carbon or climate or emission goals. And it was a small subset of that land. So it created a database and a way to begin to look at that land and realize it's not winner takes all. Like, it's not all solar and no farmland, or vice versa. That there was actually, if we went through and looked at factors like, is there solar sites that aren't taking prime ag land out, solar sites that aren't going to be harmful to sensitive ecological values like wetlands, solar that's not going to be in the view shed. You still had plenty of solar sites left to choose from. And if you could identify all those, and if the regulatory process then said, and you go in these places, you're going to have a much easier time of it. We're going to give you a quick process. That's not exactly the same as resolving all the different kinds of competing issues we're talking about. But it does seem like that's the kind of solution that our group might be led to as a way of addressing a conflict like Abby describes, which we may not be able to resolve at the micro level, but when we step back at a policy level, we start to see pathways that reduce that level of conflict.
That's great, David. And Alex, I see you got your hand up, but I'll just kind of add briefly to that. So Act 174 of, I don't know, 2016 or 18 basically required all regional planning commissions to develop enhanced energy plans as part of their regional plans, and enabled towns to do that at the municipal level. And the state, through the Department of Public Service, came up with basically some screening tools to inform that process, so that you would identify areas of known constraints to energy generation and potential constraints to energy generation. And that included things like mapped prime ag soil, wetlands, other features that, potentially could be developed, but, could be problematic, and just try to take those out of the equation. And what was left after that analysis was still a significant amount of acreage. It also looked at energy potential, like solar aspect, wind potential. So, not just pairing land that could be developed, but showing land that could be developed where there's actually an energy resource. And it showed that there was significant acreage available in the state. And then the regional planning commissions took that and demonstrated that, there was far more in each region that was needed to meet the kind of allotment necessary to comply with the state's comprehensive energy plan and the renewable energy standard. So I think that's a long way of saying, what David said succinctly, that there's plenty of land out there that we can achieve our energy generation goals in a way that is respectful of all these other land uses. But we haven't quite gone to the next step of actuating that. Those are plans. They don't have a ton of binding, legal binding character to them right now. Alex, get your hand up there.
All right. Yeah. Act 174, we're in the thick of it right now. So feel free to get me your thoughts on that and bend my arm. I'm in this discussion. We had the 9 o'clock this morning phone call. We're having it every 2 weeks to tweak it. Solar's easy to identify where it is on farmland. You can do those kind of land use GIS things, easy peasy. What about manure? Is that anywhere in this planning that we could use manure? No, we don't have a data set or whatever to identify manure. Small hydro, same thing. Maybe people hate manure digesters, maybe they hate small hydro, but at least they should be in this mix of these GIS layers, as my thought. So feel free to talk to me. Another thing that's coming up in Act 174 is, oh, by the way, we really don't want to cut down forests. That wasn't in there before. So how's that going to come in, right? And which kind of forests? We have a pretty clear layer for NRCS rated soils, right? Primary agricultural soils in statute. We don't have a good layer for what forests not to cut down. And that's another thing that we're, grappling with in Act 174. Tons and tons of trade-offs. And so Abby, it's beautiful that you're bringing this up. And that your particular situation, what I think about is compared to what? Like compared to development, right? So, would it be better to fallow that land for 20 years, take the solar out, and maybe it still could be used later? Compared to development, yeah. Why are we having the development in the first place? Rural residential zoning, right? And this farmer wants rural residential zoning because he doesn't have the money to retire, because farming isn't generally profitable, right? So what do you do when you're done at the end? How's your 401k? Not so great, right? So you need to cash out at some point, and that's why rural residential zoning has stuck around for so long instead of pushing people into those towns that David was talking about, or one reason anyhow. So there's tons of trade-offs here, and I love what you're saying. And I work hard on the agrivoltaics, dual use. One thing landowners can do is get the first right of refusal on managing that land for vegetation, because otherwise they're going to call up a landscaper who's going to come in with their truck and trailer and mow the thing. You could just as well mow the thing, right? So there's negotiations that happen too. And we are seeing a lot of sheep going in, doing a piece with WCAX on Monday on sheep in solar. So anyhow, tons of trade-offs, great discussion. I would like to see better zoning. At the same time, I get it about farmers wanting to sell their land and get out of farming. I just, I don't know. I don't have all the answers, but at least we're way better off in Vermont than we are in some places for what that's worth. But we can tweak things and get better.
Yeah, and thanks, Alex. That's a good reminder that that act that authorized municipal and regional energy planning, that work gets updated with the comprehensive energy plan. So the Public Service Department is in the process of updating the kind of filters and mapping direction for how to do that analysis for the next set of regional plans. And, my agency is bringing to that conversation the suggestion that we should try to discourage the use of forested land for energy generation when feasible alternatives exist. So there's, lots of ideas like that swirling around. John.
I'm just going to bore you following on from Alex with a personal example, because since I would guess I'm the only retired farmer in this group, but yeah, but what worked for us was we conserved our land. So it had to be sold to a farmer. And luckily, and I say this absolutely, luckily, at the time we had 2 competing organic farmers who wished to buy our farm. We owned 400 acres of really good farmland. We do have prime soils. Abby, I really don't understand why you're a little bit averse to woolly buggers running around your farm, but
Not averse, just don't like how it's always assumed the farmer will just figure everything out because
right.
They have to.
But I do think, one thing we could look at, or we've talked about for years in agriculture, is some sort of retirement program to prevent this need to cash out at the end and move on. But it's pretty universal. But I do think land conservation and keeping working lands is a program that we really benefit from here.
Judy.
So we also have our land in conservation, and the problems that we have are the hunters. We can't control them. They shoot down or tear down the no trespass signs. They get angry when we register with the town and tear down our mailboxes. And the aggravation to put it in conservation sometimes feels like it's not worth it. The police are always out there because the hunters are fighting over whose territory they're claiming, and it's not, they don't even have the right to be there. So I believe conservation is a good way to go, John, but we need help. I mean, to post 100 acres of land every year and sign those papers those post-it signs, it gets expensive, it gets time consuming, and a lot of our land is wetland. So we're walking through muck up to our knees to get to the next sign that was shot down. And so some other areas have to be looked at. My 2 houses down from me, my neighbor was shot and killed sitting at his dining room table eating dinner because of some idiot out in our meadow with an AK-47. So we need help to keep it in conservation.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Judy. It's not just the one-time benefits that come from that transaction, but it's kind of the ongoing burden of carrying that land that we all need to be thinking about.
One of the other tensions that comes up with conservation is one, as it exists at the moment, and yes, I mean, Nick is obviously a great person to bring in. Gus Seelig might be another great person to bring in. All of those pieces are really critical, and they're amazing when they work, but they often don't. They're very slow processes. There are caps on them for individual farmsteads. You often can't get private landowners to agree. And at the end of the day, again, the people who are managing the land are the people who have the least, tend to be the people who have the least rights and the least power in this equation. And that means that, and this is personal, so I won't pretend it's not. Like, that means that I am ultimately, in any conversation I enter, at least that's been my experience, at a power disadvantage in how I bring these things up, because as business has been conducted up until this point, for the type of farming that I do, we tend to be the last people considered in these discussions and seen as the least critical. And I don't understand how this work will be done moving forward if that part of the equation isn't shifted.
Well,
the people who are doing this work are critical to this, and they are not given equal voice in the process, and they do not have equal rights in the process. And that is an equity component of this work that we have to talk about at some point.
Let's hear from John, and then we're gonna have to start to wind things down.
Sorry, I mean, just following both Judy and Abby's comments make sort of emphasize, even in a small state like this, how different things are in a very short distance. You know, around, I don't have the issues that Judy has with hunters. You know, and I'm not sure whether that's because, well, I suspect it's because we are further away from populated areas. Around me, there is such competition for land that the farmers actually have a pretty powerful power, because you know, we have people who've bought their 10-acre retirement home and they want to see it managed. And yes, they will have some demands that it either has to be organic or they don't want manure spreading. I have been out in my job as executive director of our coalition to talk to people and explain that, you know, spreading manure is not a bad thing. Spreading organic fertilizer might be inorganic fertilizer might be a lot worse. You know, so, but it's just, again, it's, you know, and I know Addison County is the banana belt of Vermont in many ways, but it is interesting in a small state. We have different, within a short distance, we have different priorities.
Yeah, thanks, John. And I think just to kind of wrap this thread up, you know, land conservation has been a critical strategy in Vermont to kind of maintain our forested natural working lands. I expect it will be supporting and expanding that work will be a key component of the strategies that we develop. And within that should be this conversation around equity and how to make those programs better for the farmer, and acknowledging, you know, the range of benefits that they're providing the state through this additional climate lens, which, you know, hasn't really been part of the conservation conversation much heretofore. All right, well, it's noon. We need to give one more opportunity for some public comment. So any other thoughts on these great topics? I think a lot to think about, and we can kind of wrap them into future conversations.
Yeah, my only last thought would just be, it'd be great to have some next steps, you know, like on how are we going to actuate some of this conversation, and you know, how are we going to tee up tough issues? How are we going to, you know, identify our top line priorities?
Yep. So I was giving some thought to kind of agenda for next time, or at least maybe the next time in the following meeting. And a key piece of that is to try to get Pat Field back in here to talk through kind of our timeline to get to that July 26th deliverable deadline, and, you know, what the steps are between now and then, and, you know, to talk with us in a facilitated way around, you know, how we come up with those top line priorities and how we manage these conflicts. And, you know, conflict isn't the right word. I think these are just natural points of tension that I think good to flag and raise and are inherent in all this work. So I'm thinking that if we can get him in here next time, that might be a good way to kind of move this conversation forward, David. Okay, good. And then, the other thing I was thinking, and, Abby and I need to talk about this offline, but I believe that Just Transitions may be ready to kind of come back to us with a presentation of the guiding principles and some of the equity screening work by the next meeting. So I don't know if Iris knows one way or the other about that, but that might be another good agenda item to have for next time.
We haven't really discussed how we're doing presentations, but I would also be happy to just go through it with you all if that's what it ends up being.
Okay, well, we can figure out the best way to incorporate your all's work in future meetings. Lauren's got her hand up.
Yeah, I was just going to propose an interim next step to David's point. Bringing in Pat next week sounds great, but maybe something that can be done between now and then is what David, you originally recommended, which is as the task teams are continuing to meet between now and then, that part of the agenda of each of them is to think about those potential tension points and how their strategies might address them.
Works for me. Okay. Thanks for that, Lauren. Barring any other comments from the subcommittee, I'm going to open it back up to some public comment. Everyone good? All right. So running a little over here, but any members of the public interested in sharing some thoughts, questions, or comments before we wrap down today? Going once. Okay, Zach would like to share a comment. Let's just see. Anyone in addition to Zach would like to speak today? Okay, Zach, take a couple minutes, please. Thank you.
Yeah, it'll be less than that. Zach Porter, Conservation Law Foundation. Thanks for a great conversation today, everybody. And I just wanted to give a special thanks to David and Abby. I thought that the suggestions that were made today about kind of thinking about a net gain in the amount of forest land, ag land was such a great kind of theme to bring up today. And I love the pie analogy. And I also really appreciated Abby's comments about improving not just quantity, but quality. I think that's critical to this conversation. And so I think we'll dig into that a lot more in coming meetings, but just wanted to really highlight that, because it's not, to me, it's really not just about more farmland or more forest land. It's how we're managing that land. And so anyways, thanks again for a good discussion today.
Great, thank you, Zach. All right, any other comments from folks? All right, well, thanks everyone. That was a great conversation. Abby and I will get an agenda out hopefully sooner than I did this week to you all for next week, and enjoy your task group meetings and the lovely weekend, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you everybody so much for indulging me in that thoughtful conversation. I really appreciate it.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks all.